The fundamental purpose of language is not communication. At least that's the claim made by famous linguist Noam Chomsky, and he has a point. You guys may have figured out by now that I'm a pretty big language nerd. Certainly not enough to be a linguist myself, but enough to confuse all of my friends and relatives by randomly spewing out phrases from any number of languages. Honestly, it's a miracle that I'm as coherent as I am, which kind of lends credence to Dr. Chomsky's theory, doesn't it? Well, this week I'm doing kind of a triple whammy. I'm doing an episode of Scientific Drinking, obviously. I'm tackling one of the subjects on my to-do list, and I'm presenting the results of a class project and fulfilling the requirements to give a presentation. All of this right before I hit the road and drive out to Arizona for Thanksgiving and to film the next video. So yeah, cheers. Alright, tonight I'm drinking Coriolis Effect, a New Zealand style IPA. I'm not sure what a New Zealand style IPA is necessarily. I mean, I'm familiar with West Coast IPA and New England IPA, so this is kind of new. I mean, it tastes like a New England IPA. Maybe I'm missing something. So first things first, these are things that are definitely not linguistic relativity. The speeding up or slowing down a speech based on the size of the speaker and their proximity to massive objects, such as your mom. Talking faster when in stressful situations, like when your boss caught you eating company froyo in the freezer during your smoke break.
How on earth are you supposed to run a business when you've got no idea what's in the freezers?
You failing to convince your wife or girlfriend of your point of view because, let's face it, she made up her mind already. What linguistic relativity actually is the shaping of an individual's worldview based on the structure and grammar of their native language. So what does that actually mean? Well, first, let's take an example about directions. For most of us, describing objects in our surroundings or directions around ourselves, we use in front of us, behind us, above us, to the left, to the right, all centered around where we are at the current time. But that's not always the case in languages. Aboriginal languages such as Gugu Yimithir and others in that linguistic group don't judge it by the ecocentric point of view, but by cardinal directions. For example, this is my southeast hand. Southeast, not left. Another example might be Russian, which uses goloboy and sinyi to describe light blue and dark blue respectively. These are individual words representing what is to them distinct individual colors. But for most of us in the Western world, we just say blue, describing it as one homogeneous color, with different shades perhaps, but not distinct in itself. Speaking of colors, there's also ambiguity between blue and green. Amazigh, a African language family with one word for both blue and green, is one example, but it doesn't stop there. Arabic describes the sky as being green, while Japanese describes the green light at stoplights as being blue. And there are many other examples of this kind of ambiguity between what's blue and what's green. Another famous example is bridges. French and German both have a word for a bridge, as you might expect, but because they have gendered nouns, they describe that bridge differently. For example, in French, a bridge is le pont, which is masculine, but in German, it's described as die Brücke, which is feminine. So people in German tend to describe their bridges as elegant and flowing, while people who speak French tend to describe bridges as strong or sturdy, generally feminine and masculine terms respectively. Perception of time is another thing that is relativistic in terms of language. In English, we tend to think of things as past, present, or future, three distinct groups of time. But that's not always the case. In Chinese, they refer to things as either in the completed state or in an incomplete state, which is a little challenging to wrap your mind around when you're learning the language. Other languages don't have words for the past or future at all, but only deal within the present, such as the Piraha people in the Amazon. Counting is another thing that's different in different languages. Of course, the famous example of how French count to 100 is pretty notorious. 420s, I mean, come on, that's just impractical. It doesn't end there. Other languages only know how to count up to 4, and then there's a word for more than 4, such as the Munduruku people of the Amazon. When dealing with things that are more than 4, it takes a while for them to be accustomed to counting to 10, for example. Another example is the Warlpiri people of Australia, who only can count to 3. 1, 2, and something more than 2. And they're not the only people who count this way. Again, the Piraha people come back as an example of counting to only 1, 2, and more than 2. or one, two, and many. The Paraha people are of specific interest because, as distinct from other languages that don't have large numbers, no one has yet been able to get a member of the Paraha people to count to 10. Now that's distinct from the other ones we talked about because even with the Walpiri and the Munduruku, linguists have both been able to get members of those groups to count to 10 quite easily, relatively speaking. But not with the Paraha, and the unusual nature of that language doesn't end there. Even with a large sample size of over 1,100 phrases, in no instance has there been concrete evidence of the use of a subordinate clause. That language is so different and its effects so profound that it has turned the linguistic community on its head. Now, I feel I need to clarify something here. Talking about differences in language and how language can affect thought is in no way talking about differences in intelligence. That's a completely different thing. Any individual human, no matter where they're born and what their ethnicity is, are more or less capable of the same level of intelligence. On the day any of us are born, we have the possibility of studying quantum physics, or celestial mechanics, or brain surgery. But differences in language can provide a benefit or a hindrance to that respect after early development is complete. But that's a topic for an entirely different video. For now, let's just talk about the differences in language itself. These subjective differences may play a role in how one perceives the world and their surroundings, and this is known today as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Some linguists, principally German linguist Leo Weisberger, have claimed that these perceptive changes are significant enough to determine how one perceives the world. This was first postulated in a publication in 1929 and is known today as the strong hypothesis. It has since been met with heavy criticism from the linguistic community, and understandably so, but we'll get to that in a minute. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is named after two linguists from the 20th century, Edward Sapir and his student Benjamin Lee Whorf. However, although these two discussed the hypothesis, they never published on it, and Dr. Sapir even concluded that it was unlikely during his correspondence with Mr. Whorf. It was Henry Hoyer, another of Sapir's students, that first coined the term and published on the subject. Later, a methodology was devised to test the hypothesis by Roger Brown and Eric Lenneberg by examining the differences in the perception of colors between individuals of different linguistic groups. Their findings produced interesting results, but nevertheless, it kind of fell off the radar and by the 1960s was kind of an obscure curiosity. That changed, however, in the late 1980s, when renewed interest in the so-called weak hypothesis became of specific interest in the academic community. This weak hypothesis states that the speaker's native language only influences their thought patterns. It doesn't determine them, like with the strong hypothesis, and there's evidence to support this. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this idea isn't necessarily new. In fact, it is at least as old as Plato, and since then great minds such as St. Augustine and Kant speculated about various components of the concept. 18th century Swedish thinker Emanuel Swedenborg and 19th century German philosopher Johann Hamann and Wilhelm von Humboldt both expressed innovative, if rather racist, views of linguistic determinism, the precursor to linguistic relativism and the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Now, I won't get into the details about how this concept evolved over time, but know that it is by no means a settled matter within the academic or global community. And there's still a lot we have to learn about how language influences thought or vice versa. Many people within the academic community are curious about how language influences individuals and how it influences their thought on an individual level. But I'm more curious about the sociology of it, how it influences entire cultures and societies. This is a very difficult thing to tackle. When dealing with how languages affects the development and policy of a nation, you are fundamentally limited to a sample size equal to the number of available nations, some 200 or so, depending on which country you ask. On top of that, there are things like policy changes in response to geopolitical factors, climate change, resource availability, domestic volatility, and a host of other factors, so isolating what is determined by language as distinct from any number of other factors is, to say the least, challenging. But not to be discouraged, let's gather some data and plunge ahead forward, letting the data guide us. To satiate my curiosity and meet the demands of my class, I selected 6 groups of languages to study. It's important to note that I'm not a linguist by trade, just an enthusiast, so these groupings might not be perfect, and there's certainly room for improvement. I spoke to friends from all over the world to ask them about their native languages and how they work and how they interact with one another, and they all gave me great advice and great feedback. But again, they're not linguists either, at least not as far as I know. So going forward, there is definitely some things I could do to probably polish this up and make it a bit more accurate. Nonetheless, I appreciate all these people for taking the time out of their day to answer my seemingly probably random questions. Thanks, guys. So the first group contains the US, UK, Australia, and Denmark. I tried to collect distinct nations, all speaking languages that have a mandatory use of usually gendered pronouns or subjects, such as he, she goes, they go, you go, it goes, etc., and non-gendered nouns, the castle, the bridge, a thought, etc., and an egocentric language structure. In other words, phrases and grammatical structure often emphasize the action of the speaker or subject. The second group contains Germany, Brazil, Romania, and France. Similar to the last group, these languages usually have mandatory use of usually gendered pronouns or subjects and have egocentric language structure, but they also use gendered nouns, la familia, der Apfel, le pont, etc. The third group is the Uralic language from Finland and Hungary. There are no other examples of nations with an Uralic language as an official language, and to be honest, I have a lot to learn about the language family. And so it was added more as a curiosity, especially because the nations of Finland and Hungary are very different culturally. Would my analysis yield similarities between these nations? Well, we'll have to find out. Group 4 was Austronesian, and this was a little tricky. For this language group, I selected the Philippines, Indonesia, and Madagascar. I spoke to a friend from the Philippines, but I'm making the assumption that Indonesian and Malagasy are similar in practice since they're from the same language family. Getting data from some of these nations was a little challenging in some cases, as we'll see. Group 5 was Turkic, and I'm making a similar assumption about Turkmen and Kazakh, since they're in the same language family as Turkish. These languages have a gender-neutral pronoun, o yapti, for he, she, or it did it, but otherwise have many similarities to English in order and structure, and they don't have gendered nouns. Finally, Group 6 is generally categorized as East Asian and includes Japan, China, Vietnam, and South Korea. Aside from English, this is the group that I'm most familiar with. It is common in these languages to have no pronoun at all in the sentences. So instead of I, you, he, she, it, they go, it's just go, and the subject is contextually implied. They don't have gendered nouns, and they don't usually have an egocentric language structure. This is also kind of a loose category, since Vietnamese doesn't really fit the mold as I just outlined, but it's also a tonal language like Chinese or even Thai. But Thai can't fit in this group either, because it's part of a language isolate and has a sample size of 2 culturally and economically similar nations. So I don't think it would be possible to isolate linguistic factors from economic or political ones. That brings me to another point about how I selected these nations. I wanted nations that were linguistically similar, but culturally different. I also wanted nations that primarily spoke the language type of interest, which ruled out nations like India, South Africa, Canada, and many others, all of which were commonly multilingual, spanning different linguistic families. Finally, I wanted nations that had at least somewhat complete and accessible data, as extracted from the World Inequality Database. This really restricted my sample size and eliminated entire language groups such as Balto-Slavic, Kredai, of which Thai is a member, and many African linguistic groups for which there is little data. Speaking of data, not all countries are created equal, and thus not all of them have the same amount of information available or even the same type of information. But nevertheless, through processes of elimination, I was able to determine a ratio of average per capita income versus federal income for all the countries on this list, and social benefits paid per capita and average direct tax rate for most of the countries on this list. All of them were adjusted into US dollars, but not adjusted for inflation. Finally, I looked at how these factors changed over time, because getting a snapshot of how countries are at one particular time kind of would make it subject to a lot of the factors I mentioned earlier. But by taking a large sample and looking how it changed over time, I could kind of weed out things that were just geopolitical or economic. All right, so that's a lot of background, I know. Thanks for bearing with me. But let's finally take a look at some of the results. First, let's look at this plot of average per capita income as a ratio of government income. This was the one where I was able to include all the countries on my list. The colors indicate nations of different groups, as seen by the legend. Although this didn't produce tight groupings, which would produce a kind of aha moment, like I was really onto something, it was encouraging that they were at least kind of generally on the same scale and in the same general area. What's more is that certain factors that we might expect intuitively, such as high median income and social benefits in Finland and Denmark, are visible here. Thus, it passes a sanity check. Using statistical analysis, we can determine if the countries here match a certain pattern, and generally the answer across the board is no, not really. The only exception to this is the direct tax rate of Turkish countries, but that's only because I only had data on 2 years, and thus the data set is, well, pretty limited, and That's kind of worthless. Of course, just because there is no correlation presented here doesn't mean that there is no impact from language. What we're observing is a culmination of extremely dynamic geopolitical and economic environments. What we need to do next is subtract out the effects of some of these factors and examine the residuals. But how that is to be done is the stuff of future work. I'm sorry that 2 weeks of study can't give you all the answers. If it was that easy, we would have beat science already. That being said, there are some things that we can learn from these graphs that do not directly relate to my ongoing interest in linguistic relativity. Look here at this graph of mean per capita income as a fraction of government income. Two things stand out to me. One, that nearly everyone in the world has experienced a decline in relative per capita income. And two, that only the Scandinavian nations, such as Finland and Denmark, are bucking this trend and holding level. It would take more analysis to see if this is true across different economic groups, or if it's universally true within Scandinavia, for example. And yet more time to study and determine if that is the result of linguistic differences. Now, we've gotten pretty deep into the science there, so let's take a breath and stand back for a minute. What this data does suggest is that the strong hypothesis, first put out in 1929, is not really valid across large scales or sociologically. If it were, then these groups of languages would show a strong correlation. If language determined one's thought process, then that would show through the noise of geopolitics and the turbulence of economic waning and waxing. But assuming I got my groupings correct, that's just not the case here. However, the weak version of the theory has not yet been determined. Again, the weak theory is that language influences one's thought process. We know from psychological studies of groups of individuals that there is some kind of influence from language. Usually it's quite small and indeed weak, hence the name weak hypothesis, but it is there, and perhaps it does show on a larger scale. With few exceptions, studies that have looked at groups of individuals from different linguistic groups have shown that there is at least some small difference in the way these people perceive colors, time, and numbers. Remember at the beginning of the episode where I repeated the sentiment from Dr. Noam Chomsky, where he mentioned that the primary purpose of language wasn't communication? Well, the fact that these languages and these differences exist, and that languages are so different to begin with, kind of backs up that theory. After all, if languages were developed for the sole, or at least primary purpose of communication, then the fundamental building blocks would have been the same in all of us. We would have had to have taken those first few steps, and communication would have been the primary purpose. Anything that did not facilitate communication would have been ignored or dropped. But that's not really the case, is it? If it were, then we would have all structured our languages the same. We might have used different words and maybe expressed them a little differently, but language would have been pretty damn similar. But it's not. So why then does language even exist? If it wasn't formed to facilitate communication, to enable us to communicate with others of our same species, then why does it exist? What's the purpose of language anyway? Well, one idea is that it's there to facilitate thought, specifically complex ideas. In other words, the purpose of language might not be to help us communicate with other people, but to help us understand ourselves. Thanks for watching. Cheers.